In 1944, a 51-year-old woman retired from her job with $5,000 in savings and a $3,100 a year pension. She had never been promoted in 23 years. She earned less than $4,000 a year her entire career. She had no Wall Street connections, no financial background, and had already lost her life savings once after trusting her brother's brokerage firm, which collapsed. By any measure, her financial future looked bleak. Her name was Anne Scheiber. When she died in 1995, at the age of 101, she left behind a fortune of $22 million. Her lawyer later told the New York Times something remarkable. "You think Warren Buffett was good at this?" She ran rings around Warren Buffett, a retired tax auditor, starting at 51, with $5,000, outperforming one of the greatest investors who ever lived. In this video, I'm going to break down exactly what Anne Scheiber discovered, the insight that came from her unusual career, the simple strategy she followed for 50 years, and most importantly, what her story proves about starting late, starting small, and starting today. Because if you've ever thought it's too late for you to start investing, Anne Scheiber's story will change your mind completely. Let's get into it. Anne Scheiber was born in 1893 in Brooklyn, New York, one of 9 children. Her father died young after losing the family's savings in a failed real estate investment. At just 15 years old, Anne started working as a bookkeeper to help support her family. Despite the hardship, she put herself through college. She earned a law degree. She passed the bar exam. In the 1920s, she landed a job as an auditor for the Internal Revenue Service. For the next 23 years, she showed up. Every single day, she was, by every account, an exceptional employee. And yet, she was never promoted. Not once. Historians believe this was largely due to discrimination. Anne was a Jewish woman working in American institutions during a time when both of those facts worked against her, regardless of her competence. Her salary topped out at $4,000 a year. For 23 years of excellent work. To make things worse, in the 1930s, Anne trusted her younger brother to invest her life savings through his brokerage firm. The firm collapsed. She lost everything she had saved. By the time she retired from the IRS in 1944, at age 51, Anne Scheiber had exactly $5,000 to her name, along with a modest pension of $3,100 a year. Most people in her position would have accepted a quiet, frugal retirement and called it a life. Anne Scheiber did something else entirely, because here's what almost nobody knew about her job as an auditor. For 23 years, Anne had been reading other people's tax returns, not just regular people, wealthy people, the kind of tax returns that revealed exactly how the rich stayed rich. And she'd noticed something, a pattern that repeated across almost every single wealthy tax return she audited. That pattern would become the foundation of a $22 million fortune. Here's what Anne Scheiber noticed. After 23 years of auditing the tax returns of America's wealthiest people, almost all of them owned stocks, not real estate, not gold, not some secret investment vehicle reserved for the elite. Stocks, specifically, shares in large, established companies, the kind that paid consistent dividends year after year. This realization changed everything for Anne. She didn't have a financial advisor. She didn't have a mentor. As a reclusive, single retiree with no family guidance in this area, she had nobody pointing her in the right direction. So she taught herself. She started reading about the stock market obsessively. She studied annual reports. She attended shareholder meetings, sometimes specifically because they offered free food, which she would save and eat over the following days, a habit that became part of her legend. With her $5,000, equivalent to roughly $92,000 today, Anne began buying shares in companies she understood, companies whose products she used, companies with long histories of paying dividends: Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Bristol-Myers, Schering-Plough, Chrysler. And, because she loved the movies, entertainment companies like Paramount and Columbia Pictures. Her portfolio eventually grew to include over 100 individual stocks. She never chased a quick win. She never gambled on a single hot stock. She never tried to time the market. According to her broker, William Fay, she was never looking for a quick buck. Her whole idea was to get performance on a long-term basis. She felt over the long run her value would grow. That patience, that willingness to let decades pass without panic, is the single most important thing about Anne Scheiber's strategy. And it's the thing almost nobody has the discipline to actually do. Now let's talk about exactly how this simple insight, repeated for 50 years, turned $5,000 into $22 million. Anne Scheiber's strategy had 4 core principles, and every single one of them is something you can apply today. Principle 1. Invest in what you understand. Anne bought shares in companies whose products were part of everyday life: soft drinks, medicine, movies. She didn't speculate on industries she didn't understand. She stuck to what made sense to her, businesses that would still be needed decades later. The modern equivalent of this principle is simple. Index funds like VTI give you ownership in thousands of understandable, established businesses without needing to pick individual winners yourself. Principle 2. Reinvest every single dividend. This is where the real magic happened. Every dividend Anne received went directly back into buying more shares. Not once, not occasionally, every time, for 50 consecutive years. By the time of her death, her portfolio was generating $750,000 a year in dividend income alone. That's the result of 5 decades of consistent reinvestment, compounding on top of itself year after year. Principle 3. Minimize taxes through patience. As a former IRS auditor, Anne understood something most investors don't fully grasp. Every time you sell an investment, you trigger a taxable event. Capital gains taxes eat directly into your returns. Anne rarely sold anything. She held her positions for decades, allowing her wealth to compound without being taxed along the way. This single habit, born from her professional expertise, preserved an enormous amount of her returns that would have otherwise gone to the government. Principle 4. Live dramatically below your means. Anne's lawyer estimated she saved at least 80% of her income throughout her working life. She walked instead of taking the bus to save money. She wore the same coat for years. She lived in the same small, rent-controlled apartment in Manhattan from her retirement in 1944 until her death in 1995. Over 50 years in the same modest home. This wasn't deprivation for its own sake. It was fuel. Every dollar she didn't spend was a dollar available to compound for decades. Here's the part that should give you chills. Anne Scheiber's portfolio grew at an estimated annualized rate of roughly 14.6% over 51 years. For context, the S&P 500's average historical return is around 10%. She beat the market average. As a self-taught, 51-year-old retiree with no formal training, working entirely alone, with a $5,000 starting point, her total return over her lifetime, 440,000%. A $5,000 investment in an S&P 500 index fund over that same period would have returned approximately 25,000%. Anne beat that too. Now, you don't need to replicate her exact stock-picking skill to benefit from her core principles. In fact, the 4 principles I just outlined: understand what you own, reinvest everything, minimize unnecessary taxes, and live below your means, work just as well, arguably even better, with simple low-cost index funds today. Let's look at what this means in real numbers for you. Let's talk about what Anne Scheiber's story actually means for you, especially if you think you've started too late. A 2022 study found that nearly half of Americans believe you can be too old to start investing for retirement. Anne Scheiber started at 51 with $5,000 and built a $22 million fortune over the next 50 years. But let's say you don't have 50 years. Let's look at more realistic timeframes. Scenario 1. You're 40 years old right now. You invest $5,000 to start, then add $500 a month for 25 years until you're 65. At a 10% average annual return, the historical average of the U.S. stock market, you end up with $720,000. Scenario 2. You're 45. Same starting amount, same monthly contribution, but only 20 years until 65. You end up with $420,000. Scenario 3. You're 50. Close to Anne's actual starting age. $5,000 to start, $500 a month for 15 years until 65. You end up with $230,000. Now here's the part that matters most. None of these numbers are as dramatic as Anne's 440,000% return. She had an extraordinary decades-long track record built on careful stock selection and an unusually long time horizon. But here's what all 3 of these scenarios prove. Starting at 40, starting at 45, starting at 50, it still works. It's still life-changing money. From someone who believed they'd started too late. Anne Scheiber didn't have the luxury of starting in her 20s. She didn't have a financial education. She didn't have anyone to guide her. She had a decision and 5 decades of consistency. If you're sitting here right now, in your 30s, 40s, or even your 50s, thinking it's too late for you, Anne Scheiber's $22 million fortune says otherwise. The only real mistake is waiting even longer. Before we finish, I want to talk about what Anne Scheiber did with her $22 million, because this is the part of her story that I think matters most. Anne never married. She had no children. She lived alone in the same small apartment for over 5 decades. When she died in 1995, she donated her entire fortune, every single dollar of that $22 million, to Yeshiva University, specifically to fund scholarships for women. She had been denied promotions throughout her career, likely because she was a Jewish woman in a discriminatory era. She never got the opportunities she deserved, so she made sure other women would. Her attorney recalled her saying, "Someday, when I'm long dead, there will be some women who won't have to fend for themselves." That scholarship fund still exists today, still funding women's education, decades after Anne's death. Here are the 5 lessons I take from her life. Lesson 1. It is never too late. Anne started at 51 and outperformed Warren Buffett. Lesson 2. You don't need connections, a financial background, or insider knowledge. You need patience and consistency. Lesson 3. Reinvest everything, every dividend, every gain, back into the system. Let compounding do what it does best. Lesson 4. Live below your means, deliberately and consistently. The gap between what you earn and what you spend is your entire fuel source. Lesson 5. Build something bigger than yourself. Anne's wealth didn't just change her own life, it's still changing lives today, 3 decades after her death. Anne Scheiber proved that the biggest barrier to building wealth isn't your age, your salary, or your starting point. It's whether you start at all. Anne Scheiber never sought recognition. She lived quietly. She wore the same coat. She walked instead of taking the bus. And she built one of the greatest investment track records in history, entirely on her own, starting at an age most people consider too late. You don't need her exact stock-picking skill to follow her core principles. Open a brokerage account. I personally use Trading 212, and the link is in the description. It's free to open, and you can start with as little as $1. Put your money into low-cost index funds like VTI. Reinvest every dividend automatically. Live below your means, even if it's just by a small margin. And then, be patient. Let time do what it did for Anne Scheiber. It doesn't matter if you're starting at 25, 35, or 51 years old like she did. What matters is that you start. If you want to see exactly how to build a simple 3-fund portfolio like the one I recommend, that video is linked in the top right corner. Subscribe for a new video every week. I'll see you in the next one.